A very warm welcome to this webinar with the title Mobilizing Anti-Money Laundering Actors in the Fight Against Modern Slavery. My name is Simon Zaug. I am the anti-money laundering specialist of the Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking Initiative, short FAST. This webinar is co-organized by two FSRBs of the sub-Saharan Africa, namely ESAAMLG and GIABA, and the Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking Initiative, as I said, short FAST. FAST is a multi-stakeholder initiative based at UN University, so the United Nations University Center for Policy Research in New York, that works to mobilize the financial sector against modern slavery. And I think it's important to say that when we speak about modern slavery, what we mean by this term. So modern slavery means it's an umbrella term comprising human trafficking, forced labor, and child labor. What are the objectives of this webinar today? Well, the ultimate goal of this webinar is to raise awareness of modern slavery in the region, in the sub-Saharan region, and to improve the quality and the quantity of modern slavery related suspicious transaction reports submitted by obliged entities to the respective financial intelligence units. Because everywhere we go, we see that the number of STRs are just very low. And more SARs, this should consequently result in more modern slavery investigations, convictions, and ultimately result then in more remedy for victims and survivors, so where this money belongs to. In order to achieve this goal, I think when you look at the agenda, you see that we have a very interesting 2.5 hours ahead of us. So we will present, FAST will present a couple of tools and activity we have developed and come up with in the past to fight modern slavery, to equip the financial sector in its fight. We also give a platform to the two FSRBs, GIABA and ESAAMLG, to showcase, promote their work they've done in the past and they're still doing on this important topic. And then, of course, also financial inclusion plays a crucial role in this webinar. Just very short, some housekeeping rules. There is the option of simultaneous interpretation to French and Portuguese. So if you would wish to listen to this webinar in French and or Portuguese, just select the channel. And also, if you would like to ask questions, there is a Q&A button function at the bottom of your screen. We try to accommodate questions after the different presentations if time allows. Otherwise, of course, we will answer these questions in written. But now, without further ado, I would like to hand over to Fikile Sita, the Executive Secretary of ESAAMLG, for the keynote remarks. So please, Fikile, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Simon. Good day, everyone. Simon, can you confirm that you can hear me?
I can hear you well.
All right. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank the organizers, the UN FAST, in particular Simon and his colleagues, as well as our co-organizer, GIABA. I'd like to extend a special thanks to a friend and a colleague, Daniel Telesca, who introduced us to this important work. As some of you may be aware, Daniel has taken up a new position as head of the German FIU. I have no doubt that he'll do exceedingly well in this role too, given his previous roles as the head of the Liechtenstein FIU and subsequent role as head of MROS, the Swiss FIU, before joining the UN FAST. We wish him well. Please convey this message to him. ESAAMLG appreciates this opportunity to facilitate this webinar in collaboration with our sister organization, GIABA. For those who are not familiar with the acronyms, GIABA is the West African Fatah-style regional body. I won't try the French acronym because I'll just murder it and they won't be happy. as well as UN FAST, as I've already indicated. I believe this webinar is an opportune time for different stakeholders to discuss the main problem of mutual interest, that is how to prevent the region's financial systems, our fragile economies, and the rest of the world from the evils of money laundering associated with modern day slavery and trafficking in persons. I'm pleased that our member countries heeded the call to participate in this crucial webinar. I'm also delighted that we'll get to hear directly from the survivors, such as Malaika, whose story and messages have stayed with me since I met her for the first time in Cape Town, South Africa. I therefore consider it an honor for me to be here this afternoon and to have an opportunity of addressing such an impressive audience with diverse background and experience. This webinar is not only important, but timely as well for the sub-Saharan region. As you may know, the region is faced with multiple transnational criminal security threats and other forms of serious organized crimes, including slavery, trafficking in human beings, smuggling of migrants, and money laundering. We are not winning the war against these acts. It is therefore critical that we explore other avenues in order to win the war. These avenues may include collaborating with other key stakeholders, such as the survivors themselves who've experienced these ills, as well as the private sector. It is clear that we cannot continue operating in silos. We need one another in order to win the battle. According to the June 2023 FAST guideline, there's an estimated 49.6 million people in conditions of modern slavery, human trafficking globally. Each year, these crimes generate around about 150 billion dollars in profits through the exploitation of people. This means that human exploitation is the most pervasive criminal economy in the world. However, the region and our country-specific figures on STRs, investigations, prosecutions, as well as asset freezes and seizures do not seem to reflect these worldwide estimates. To do better, we must counter these crimes and associated with money laundering in a concerted manner. I believe that bringing together all private and public stakeholders in one webinar at this vital moment is in itself part of a winning strategy for defeating the crimes in our continent. This is an opportunity to share best practices and discuss ways to collaboratively combat these heinous crimes. Conversations and collaborations of this kind should continue for African countries, as they will enable our countries to develop implementation plans that will become an integral part of reforms to execute as part of our strategic strategies. ESAAMLG and GIABA have also conducted typology studies on trafficking in persons. Given what we know now and the gaps in our country's national risk assessments, we could explore updating our studies by adding issues of modern slavery. The FIU Forum of ESAAMLG has also a permanent agenda item on preventing and fighting slavery, trafficking in human beings, and associated money laundering. And this kind of webinar will enable us to enrich our discussions on the subject. Ladies and gentlemen, I understand that in terms of the legal framework, the sub-Saharan African region has made concerted efforts to ensure that our laws and policies are comprehensive enough to fight these crimes. Generally, the basic foundations of the required framework, such as legal, regulatory, and institutional structures, are in place in many of the region's member states, albeit the need for continuous improvement in line with international standards. However, it is important for me to stress that having a comprehensive framework alone is not enough. What is crucial is how effective our implementation systems and their impact in reducing money laundering and criminal activities such as slavery and human trafficking are. Thus, as part of deliberations during this webinar, I urge you to consider practical ways in which we can build effective systems to combat these crimes. The development of effectiveness capacity among the sub-Saharan African countries cannot be overemphasized in light of ravaging impact of the crimes on socio-economic development agenda in our region. My quick perusal of the agenda indicates that you have an interesting program ahead of you. I know that you'll be covering a lot of important details on different topics relating to modern slavery, trade, trafficking in human beings, and associated money laundering. I'm glad that this webinar is designed to cover thematic areas and that you will use this opportunity to tap into the knowledge of those that will be participating in this webinar. Above all, cooperation and coordination are key. I've also learned that the issue for discussion going to be supported by a true story to be presented by one of the victims, Malaika. I also like to acknowledge those amongst us today who have lived experience of modern slavery, trafficking in persons and migrant slavery, and who, despite having experienced this worst humanity, continue to hold and inspire hope that we can do better. In conclusion, I wish to reiterate that our commitment to continuously improve our measures in addressing these crimes. We fully appreciate that the spirit behind this kind of important webinar is to discuss on the effectiveness of the anti-money laundering associated with trafficking in human beings and migrant smuggling systems that are currently in place for fighting these crimes. I also appreciate the important role played by the UN FAST. I've noted that you have produced a number of informative documents for our region, including money laundering risk assessments on modern day slavery, money laundering with toolkits and guidelines for practitioners and reporting entities to monitor and detect STRs. These forms of interventions will assist deeply in trying to curb these crimes. I've learned that similar webinar was organized for CFATF members, and we believe that it was equally fulfilling for the members in terms of appreciating the issues. We are also delighted that our region was next in line to be considered for this webinar. I look forward to discussions amongst ourselves to come up with appropriate recommendations, which will be used as a basis for reviewing and strengthening sub-Saharan African laws, institutional arrangements, and effectiveness in preventing and fighting slavery, human trafficking, migrants, smuggling, and associated money laundering. Finally, I declare this webinar open. I wish you a most fruitful discussion this afternoon with interesting, stimulating discussions as well as exchange of knowledge, vital in improving our African continent's readiness to deal with these crimes. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Fikile, for setting the stage of these 2.5 hours for this webinar, and especially also for stressing the importance of effectiveness. And I hope that this webinar actually contributes the member states and their effectiveness. I would now like to introduce our next speaker, the CEO of Footprint to Freedom, and also a survivor of modern slavery, Malaika Oringo, who shares her view, her perspective on this heinous crime and her story. So please, Malaika, I'm very grateful that you're here with us today, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Simon, and thank you very much, our keynote speaker. It's nice to see you all on call, but first I would like to acknowledge again the FAST initiative for putting survivor inclusion at the core of their work. As a survivor, I'm truly honored to be part of the solution, especially I being a survivor from Africa, exploited from Europe, to bring in not only my lived experiences, but also the experiences of so many survivors across the world that I've worked with. One thing that has always strikes me are the numbers. As our keynote speaker mentioned, there's a current estimate of 49.3 million people enslaved in the world today. And in Africa, we have more than 7 million men and women trapped in modern day slavery. And these numbers do not really do us justice, because most trafficking and modern day slavery happens in the informal sector. So these numbers do not actually depict what is actually happening in Africa. Africa has got 64% vulnerability score. What does this mean? It leaves a lot of men and women vulnerable to human trafficking. For me, these numbers are not just numbers, but they're kind of pressing us to act urgently in supporting victims and in collaboration, as our keynote speaker said, to support survivors to exit slavery and also in their reintegration. Today, I want mainly to share my experience as a survivor about what lured me into exploitation, and also this experience kind of resonates with other survivors, but also what are the aftermaths of exploitation and the challenges we face in reintegration, especially access to financial independence. Let me begin from why do survivors or victims end up in slavery? There are so many reasons, but I'll just focus on the few that resonates well with me. One of which are the socioeconomic vulnerability, conflict and instability. That was one of the major drives that I ended up into exploitation. And for others, I see rural-urban migration, climate change, exploitation of natural resources, gender-based violence, and impunity of traffickers, especially in Africa. But most importantly, in focus for sub-Saharan Africa, the existence of deceptive recruitment, debit bondage, and easy movement of money for traffickers is making human trafficking a low-risk business for traffickers. Many of us have been deceived by recruiters who plant a bright future outside our countries to promise us a better future. They get us in different places within our communities, from our homes, deceiving our parents, from schools. Some convince us on social medias, but some recruiters, unfortunately, are our family members. Before I go into depth about the consequences of human trafficking and how it manifests, I would like Jacobo to allow me to share a short video of Joy, an anti-human trafficking awareness movie. This Joy story resonates well with countless African survivors who are enslaved across the world, especially in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Could you please share a short video before I continue?
This one's wow, I like the shape. But no problem. I know how to do this one.
Oh, please, this job is too hard for me to do. I don't want to do this job, please, ma. Any other job. I can clean, I can cook, I can wash clothes, I can do anything. I can even clean your house, please. Any other job.
Too hard. You wanted to come Europe. Now you are in Europe.
So you have to work and give me my money. You like, you know, like. Now shall we?
In this game, it's the survivor of the fittest. That means if I have to kill you to pay off my debt, I will. And I don't trust you, so don't trust me either. Only trust yourself.
Thank you for allowing me to share that video. Sometimes we talk about human trafficking in numbers, but sometimes we need to put faces on the actual reality of human trafficking. This story resonates with so many survivors I've worked with in Europe and those ones I've worked with who have been reintegrated back. But due to the limited time on the video, we didn't see the actual problem when Joy was reintegrated back to Africa. She was deported back to Africa. She was deported with nothing but her clothes on, with no identification, with no document, after working for 10 years in prostitution to pay up a debit that for bringing her to Europe. You can imagine only the flight ticket to bring someone to Europe required her to sell her body for 10 years to pay the pimp. So this shows a different perspective on how human trafficking manifests and how survivors end up being lured into prostitution, labor trafficking. And to a larger extent, when they come home with different trauma, post-traumatic stress. But most of all, they do not have identification because they've been confiscated by their former employers. But at the same time, the communities do not have the empathy or the knowledge on how to support these survivors and victims. Myself, when I was reintegrated or after exiting exploitation, I experienced severe economic vulnerability, financial exclusion, that put me at a risk of being re-trafficked and forced to work in an informal economy. Many survivors like myself and also others, they face difficulties in attempting to access financial services or open bank accounts due to the stigma associated with their experiences. The existing onboarding within the banks is not trauma-informed. They lack understanding about the complexities of modern day slavery. Moreover, they lack flexibility to support survivors. In fact, survivors are told to recount their story over and over again in order for them to be taken serious. Also, despite the fact that the digitalization of the banking services has increased access to finance, I believe it has left some survivors behind. Those ones who do not have the technological literacy and those who do not have the smartphones. Another issue that I've realized when survivors are trying to reclaim their life is the high interest rates from the banking fees and the length procedures and delays in accessing the compensation packages due to lack of agencies when survivors choose agencies in which bank they would like to work with, or where should they send their compensation, and also kind of lack of already existing accounts. So with that in mind, what can the bank do, or what can other private institutions do to support survivors? One crucial step, I believe, in survivor recovery is achieving economic and financial freedom. And the financial institution plays a vital role in survivors attaining that. These are some of the few ways I can suggest that I know that they're already working on it, but as our keynote speaker said, that we need to continue reaffirming this supporting mechanism of survivors, one of which is trauma-informed onboarding. Working with survivors from Africa, and being a survivor myself, one thing that is lacking is understanding trauma within the banking system, not only the banking system, the community as large. We've been raised to normalize trauma and abuse to an extent that you cannot complain when it comes having experienced traumatic experience. So we need the banking staff to be trained about the complexities of modern day slavery, to provide them a deep understanding of the experiences and the challenges. But at the same time, it also involves creating safe spaces and environments that can help survivors when they try in the process of opening up bank accounts. Also, I think the bank needs to implement more identification mechanisms to help identify potential victims and survivors within their banking, with their banks. But this goes hand in hand with collaborative approaches, working with the law enforcement, and also working with survivor advocates. But one thing that also I would really recommend is the referral mechanism is still not clear when it comes to supporting survivors. Most people think that victims and survivors are the job of a problem of the government and the non-government organization. The government itself and the non-government organization, but the institution, the banking institution, has also a responsibility on working with survivors or kind of referring them to the right support. Microfinance and credit initiative are very key examples that are happening, but I think we need to kind of enforce more tactics or more lessen interest rates when it comes to survivors getting these loans. One thing I would like to emphasize on is engagement and inclusion of survivors. And inclusion of survivors means that including survivors from their diversity, because survivors, as Simon said, it's human trafficking and modern day slavery manifests in different ways. It can be labor trafficking, prostitution, or sex trafficking, or criminality. So we need to engage the diversity of survivors to bring that diversity in perspective in informing our practices and strategies. As a survivor myself, I cannot stress enough the urgency of addressing the issue of money movements to sustain this crime. As we've seen from Joy, the woman has been extracting money from more than 50 girls, 100 girls in the last 10 years, but she's not accountable. So looking at that story and the experiences that I've seen with different survivors that I've worked with, either they held criminal records and bad credits because of the criminality actions that were forced to do by the traffickers, but at the same time, because of lack of identification and those bad credits on their bank accounts, they are denied access to finance. So it should be the responsibility, or the banking institution should be accountable not only to hold the money of these criminal activities as gatekeepers, but also to conduct kind of financial investigation. On the last mark, as we commence on this discussion and training, I want to kind of emphasize on two crucial perspectives. One of which we should look at survivor engagement in the banking institution as a return to investment. When we work with survivors, they enhance the banks at all private, or not only banks, but the private sectors, to have the ability to detect and prevent the current and future crimes, and also to develop more effective strategies. But at the same time, I want us not only to focus on supporting survivors with the mindset that survivors might only need cash to be reintegrated or to fully reclaim their lives. Survivors might need other support, like intellectual capacity, like access to scholarship, access to education, also access to justice, being able to pay their legal fees to make sure that traffickers are held accountable. So with that in mind, working with survivors as allies, as stakeholders, but also having policies that internalize due diligence and corporate responsibility that are embedded in the banking institution, but working in collaboration with other stakeholders or private sectors and the government, we will be able to achieve a comprehensive response to end human trafficking. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Malaika, for this powerful statement, especially for stressing and explaining what the consequences are of experiencing modern slavery, and then what role the financial sector, of course, can play. So thanks so much. We have one question. It's in Portuguese, but don't worry, I translate it for you into English. We are a little bit running behind schedule, so I will read the question, Malaika, and then if you could just maybe in a few words answer it, that would be great. So the question is, I would like to thank Ms. Malaika for sharing and congratulate her on her courage. I would like to ask her in what aspect she thinks that the police authorities and the courts could improve to help the victims and the criminals of this deplorable crime.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think there are so many major approach they can use, but one is working in collaboration. The law enforcement always works in silos, but when they work in collaboration with other entities like the non-government organization or other private sectors, they are able to understand the exact context of the problem. For example, there has been lack of proper coordination between the psychologists, the social workers, the banking institution, and the law enforcement. So what is really required is training the law enforcement about not only identifying because they know, but how to deal with trauma, how to deal with people who are traumatized. But at the same time, work in a collaboration. But because in collaboration, we're able to reduce the burden of proof, that survivors have to retell their story over and over again to be taken as victims who need support.
Thanks so much, Malaika. And actually, you perfectly set the stage for our next intervention on financial inclusion, namely. So the next intervention is from Leona Vaughan. She's the Vulnerable Populations Lead of the FAST initiative, and her presentation is on FAST's work on financial inclusion in the region. Please, Leona.
Thank you, Simon, but also thank you to Malaika for really setting the scene as to why financial inclusion is such an important issue. So Fikele opened the discussion really around the numbers. We only have estimates of modern slavery. The global estimates is 49.6 million, an increase of 25% in just the last 5 years. Which definitely indicate that achieving the Sustainable Development Goal to eradicate modern slavery is not going to be possible, and that we need more stakeholders to be involved in reducing and stopping modern slavery than ever before. For Africa, it is estimated that 6.9 million people are affected by forced labour. This places Africa fourth in the regions that have the highest absolute numbers of people in forced labour. And it also places them fifth in the regions that have the highest prevalence of forced labour. So again, this is forced labour only, not all different aspects of modern slavery, which include child labour, child marriage, commercial sexual exploitation, for example, isn't always classed as forced labour. So that just gives you a bit of a background. And like I say, the global estimates on modern slavery are exactly that. It gives us, it reminds us that the phenomena is very underreported and under-identified. But also the data helps us to also be reminded that high-income countries have a significant issue with modern slavery, and the victims are very often from the global south. The data also showed that modern slavery remains a gendered phenomenon. So, for example, there are twice as many men than women in forced labour, that women dominate forced labour in domestic work, and that men dominate forced labour in construction. That 4 out of 5 people in commercial sexual exploitation are women and girls. And it also specifically highlights the vulnerabilities of migrants and displaced people. So what does this have to do with financial inclusion? Well, 24% of the global population are financially excluded. So that means that they're unbanked or underbanked. This is a vulnerable population of around 1.4 billion people globally with no access to formal financial institutions such as banks or lenders. And the populations who often experience financial exclusion are often also marginalised from society in many other ways relating to poverty, education level, gender, ethnicity, citizenship, and so on. The World Bank published a report at the end of 2022 entitled The Impact of the Financial Action Task Force Recommendations and Their Implementation on Financial Inclusion, Insights from Mutual Evaluations and National Risk Assessments. And this report really speaks to how financial exclusion makes populations already vulnerable, actually more vulnerable to involvement in money laundering and terrorist financing. It also identifies that the implementation of international standards on anti-money laundering and terrorist financing actually can contribute to increasing financial exclusion, especially through de-risking, which has a detrimental impact, particularly in low-income and global south countries where financial exclusion is already high. So what's the work that FAST has been doing on financial exclusion? We refer to financially excluded people and the groups identified by the global estimates on modern slavery as vulnerable populations. So we've done research on the needs of vulnerable populations, which has prioritised high-risk groups. So, for example, modern slavery survivors who are at risk of re-victimisation, refugees escaping conflict and crisis, including those displaced or on the move because of climate crisis, high-risk geographies, and high-risk sectors, such as the artisanal gold and cocoa sectors. We undertake a lot of work to support the financial sector to increase access to financial services for populations who are vulnerable to modern slavery, and simultaneously ensure that anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing regulations are adhered to. For survivors, we've done this for the Survivor Inclusion Initiative, which I'll talk about in a moment, and particularly in our support to the South African Anti-Money Laundering Integrated Task Force, who have been scoping out how to expand access to financial services for people who have either experienced modern slavery or are very vulnerable to it. So the Survivor Inclusion Initiative was a flagship initiative for the FAST team. It started in 2019. It's focused on the UK, Canada and US. There are 14 banks involved and 30 support organisations who work directly with survivors, mainly in the US. Now, this initiative has opened almost 3,000 bank accounts to survivors of modern slavery through developing various ways of simplifying due diligence. So like I mentioned before, the World Bank and FATF research has shown that financial institutions can often misinterpret the FATF standards in such a way that financial exclusion is created or worsened. But this isn't just in grey listed countries or global south countries. For example, in Canada, we've worked with the Canadian authorities and supervisors to simplify due diligence, specifically their financial consumer body and their FIU FinTrack, who recently released a technical guidance note to all financial institutions to state that they expect them to support financial inclusion for the most vulnerable people in their society, including survivors. We've also supported the European Banking Authority on providing a guidance note to banks and payment service providers on how to ensure financial access for refugees fleeing Ukraine, as well as monitor for potential modern slavery related suspicious transactions. So these examples can be learned from, as can other examples of work already in the global south. Regions, for example, where cash-based transactions dominate, or where the communities are largely rural, or in countries who are under increased monitoring by FATF. So we've developed additional work and research focused on the Global South, particularly the regions of Latin America and the Caribbean and West Africa. So as I've said, World Bank reports and our experience as FAST shows us that countries under increased monitoring by FATF or countries in the Global South who experience high levels of de-risking are understandably quite risk averse when it comes to including clients perceived as risky in some way. But on the other hand, these groups are also highly vulnerable to the risk of modern slavery and human trafficking. I'm going to run through this quite quickly. I know that we're against time today, but this diagram shows you how different types of vulnerabilities intersect to make financial exclusion a risk multiplier for modern slavery. Now, Malika spoke a lot to this, you know, desperately trying to gain access to finance for life events, such as burials or weddings, to pay recruiter fees for work overseas. These are all common features of survivors' stories of modern slavery and human trafficking. And many survivors tell us that actually being unable to access financial services, formal financial services, meant that they were often dependent on informal economies, cash-based transactions, which made them more vulnerable to abuse and exploitation, including being placed in debt bondage, as Malika and the film Joy demonstrated, with employers or those who facilitated their employment. So we know that financial exclusion is a risk multiplier for people experiencing modern slavery, but we also know that it can be a consequence of the experience of being trafficked or exploited. A lack of access to financial remedy, lack of seizure and redistribution of perpetrators' assets further increases survivors' financial exclusion, but the lack of access to basic banking services and products often leaves survivors struggling to recover and become financially reintegrated into society, and therefore the risk of re-victimization increases. And these barriers include not having documentary ID, as Malika mentioned, no permanent address, as well as experiencing barriers that resulted from their experience of exploitation, so criminal records or bad credit status. So to meet survivors' needs, we work with financial institutions to simplify customer due diligence and their know your customer processes, to accept alternative identification methods, to accept addresses, for example, of survivor support organisations or legal advocates, to manually override bad credit reports and build in risk mitigation, such as the mitigation, such as building into the initial stages of onboarding limited transaction amounts, providing prepaid credit cards to rebuild credit, or not allowing international payments, for example. And all of this work increases protection for survivors of modern slavery. Now, I'm just going to talk very quickly about some work that we did in West Africa. So we work on the universal basis that increasing the amount of people in the formal financial system increases the visibility of transactions which may be related to modern slavery, and therefore makes it more likely that suspicious transactions can be spotted and modern slavery can be detected and disrupted. But also increasing financial inclusion provides protection to the most vulnerable in our communities. The African continent is estimated to lose approximately $89 billion annually through illicit financial flows. Not all related to modern slavery, but when we consider that worldwide, the figure that Fikele also mentioned, that $150 billion are seen annually from forced labour alone in the system, it's likely that modern slavery is a large proportion of those flows out of the continent. So we undertook some research in the high-risk sectors of cocoa and gold in Ghana, connecting financial inclusion and AML in these high-risk value chains. I'm going to skip very quickly to what we found. So we framed our findings within environmental, social and governance risks. We found that these risks intersected and mutually reinforced each other within these communities. We undertook a deep dive, really, but in a very short space of time, into climate change and inequalities for these sectors. And we found evidence which said that these risks to modern slavery for communities who were affected by the value chains, in particular, included debt bondage, labour exploitation and child labour. But what we heard from our participants was also that child labour was described in this study as having been dealt with as a single isolated social issue, rather than thinking about it as part of impacts on specific affected communities. But eliminating the presence of children in these specific sectors had not eliminated the risks which still faced the communities, who were reported as cumulatively still very vulnerable. For cocoa and gold, of interest to this group was that the National Risk Assessment mentioned artisanal cocoa and gold, but when we spoke to the public and private sector actors in the country, they were either unaware or they didn't know what that meant for them in practical terms. And so our recommendations in this research were made to financial sector actors, including regulators and supervisors, to find ways to synthesize their work across all of the environmental, social and governance goals to prioritize the challenges of environmental damage, climate crisis and business and human rights. The financial vulnerabilities, just to give you an idea of what we found, the work of vulnerability was often due to a combination of being completely unbanked with no access to financial services and products at all, or being underbanked in a number of ways. For example, farmers who were banked often only had access to basic banking instead of business services, which A, didn't make payments to labourers transparent, so we didn't know whether exploitation was happening or not, and B, didn't help them in managing the cocoa farm day-to-day activities. Workers who were banked but had no credit file, or what's called a thin file credit, were judged as too risky for credits and loans from financial institutions. And this had a number of consequences. Firstly, that there was a reliance on informal loans for workers in both sectors, often with high interest rates or conditions which put land ownership at risk. And more specifically for minors, we found that they were in situations of indebtedness to their sponsors, which were akin to debt bondage. Interestingly as well, we found that farmers were increasingly being enrolled into digital wallets, but they didn't have high levels of literacy or digital literacy, and therefore they were left open to exploitation. So what we try to encourage within countries is that they take a risk-based approach to considering financial exclusion as a risk multiplier for modern slavery, considering the high-risk nature of the sectors within their country and the high-risk communities such are given in this example on this slide. This is not just something that FAST have decided is a priority. FATF have identified, as have the World Bank, that financial inclusion needs to be better and more meaningfully reflected in country mutual evaluations, and that modern slavery needs to be better reflected in national risk assessments. So I'll leave it there. I know that others are going to take this up in detail, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Leona, for this very interesting intervention, especially for showing us the relation between modern slavery and financial inclusion, exclusion, and also how this relates actually to the anti-money laundering world. There are a few questions. Leona, I suggest that you answer them in written, if that's fine to you. Just
that's actually fine.
Mindful of time. And this allows us really to have also enough time for the other speakers coming after now. So thanks, Leona, very much for also answering these questions in written. They are in the Q&A function. And with that, I would like to introduce our next two speakers, actually. So Muluken Irga Dubale, representing ESAAMLG, and Umaru Muazu representing GIABA. As I said at the beginning of this webinar, for us, it's crucial to give the floor to the representatives of the FSRBs to showcase their good work on modern slavery and to address actually their members in this opportunity. So I would now first hand over to Muluken, and after your presentation, Muluken, you can directly hand over to Muazu for his intervention. So Muluken, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Simon. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, and we can also see the screen. Okay,
I really appreciate that. Colleagues, within the time span that we are having, I'm going to briefly highlight on the relevance of modern slavery and trafficking in persons to AML safety efforts in the ESAAMLG region. As introductory remark, the purpose of this presentation is just to show some highlights, how we can link up the issues to do with modern slavery and trafficking in human beings with money laundering. We are going to attempt to explain the role of ESAAMLG in combating this kind of crimes, both from a predicate and a money laundering point of view. Maybe as a starting point, my colleague Leona has also touched on it. We have got core mandates, which is more or less similar with the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force. We have got 4 mandates. First, we participate normally as part of the global network in the policy-making process in terms of setting the FATF standards, which are currently 40 recommendations and 11 immediate outcomes. We also assess our jurisdiction based on the FATF methodology. We also carry out or conduct typology studies and issue guidance whenever necessary, especially whenever there are guidance which have not been issued by any global network. We make focus on those guidance and then we provide them for our member jurisdiction. And finally, we also have a process of public identification, especially when we come across with our members with strategic deficiencies issues. We work hand in hand with a global network and the FATF to make sure that those countries are addressing their identified strategic deficiencies. These are the 2 documents important for AML safety efforts at the global arena. The FATF recommendation together with its interpretive notes and the methodology that we normally use for assessing our member jurisdictions. I think they are available on the FATF website or ESAAMLG or any FSRB website for you to download and read them. Normally, when you look at the relevant standards on anti-trafficking in human beings, anti-modern slavery or AML, there are so many recommendations. I can say that all the 40 recommendations, all the FATF 40 recommendations, they might have in one way or another, impact on the way how we are criminalizing and fighting those kind of crimes. The first important standard is recommendation 1 and 2. These 2 recommendations, they guide countries on how to understand risks which may emanate from different predicate offense and money laundering, including from human trafficking. The FATF standard is set in a way that there is no like modern slavery as such, as a predicate offense, but the manifestations of modern slavery are set in the FATF standards, like in the form of sexual exploitation, child exploitation, human trafficking, and so on and so on. And those are called to be designated categories of predicate offenses, which should have to be criminalized and considered to be predicate offense for money laundering. So we have got recommendation 3, which talks about the criminalization of money laundering, and then from 9 up to 32, it's really broad. Starting from preventive measures, suppression measures, investigation powers, supervision, and so on. The standard does not stop there. As Madam ES of ESAAMLG was saying, there are also issues to do with effectiveness. So immediate outcome 1, we talk about risk understanding and coordination. immediate outcome 2 that talks about international cooperation, including on, fighting the crimes together at international level. We also have immediate outcome 5 that talks about transparency of legal persons and arrangements. We also have a money laundering investigation together with the investigation on the associated predicate offenses, especially by conducting parallel financial investigation and applying special investigation techniques. We also have got asset recovery regimes, which are covered under immediate outcome 8. Sorry, because of time, I might be in a rush in relation to these points. Now, based on the standards, ESAAMLG as one of the 9 FATF-style regional bodies was established in 1999 in Arusha, and its objective is to develop mechanism to cooperate in the implementation of AML safety programs, especially by adopting and implementing the FATF standards. When I say FATF standards, there are 40 FATF recommendations together with their interpretive notes, and then the extent to which countries are achieving desired outcomes can also be explained in terms of the 11, what we call immediate outcomes. ESAAMLG currently has 20 member jurisdictions. The Democratic Republic of Congo is a regional observer of ESAAMLG, and Burundi is an observer and now seeking full membership. So when Burundi joins ESAAMLG as a full member at the upcoming September meeting in Kasane, Botswana, we will become an organization with 21 member countries. Now, coming to the main point, this is a principle or the philosophy being followed by ESAAMLG. We believe that trafficking in human beings and modern slavery have linkages both with money laundering and terrorism financing issues. We have also we have also observed some criminal patterns and trends in relation to this kind of linkages. So at the same time, we also recognize the magnitude of the problem of this kind of crime in the region, in Africa in general, as the previous speakers were noting. So if we are saying there is a linkage, a strong linkage between fighting the predicate offenses like modern slavery, trafficking human beings, migrant smuggling, and money laundering, there is a strong linkage. What it means is fighting money laundering means fighting also illicit financial flows in relation to trafficking in human beings and modern slavery. So by fighting money laundering, we can also fight these kind of crimes, and criminals can be discouraged in committing the crimes associated with, organized crimes, trafficking human beings and modern slavery. At the same time, we also recognized human rights issues and vis-a-vis AML safety efforts. As you may know, colleagues, modern slavery, trafficking human beings, they really violate human rights aggressively. And since ESAAMLG also follows a philosophy that we can fight this kind of crimes through fighting money laundering, there might be some limitation on human rights, but the limitation on human rights is also allowed under international human rights instruments as far as they are proportional, have passed legal test and so on. So based on this understanding, we believe that the FATF standards in general, they complement to the relevant UN resolutions, legal instruments, and so on, in relation to the protection and fulfillment of human rights. So I'm really glad that today we are gathering here to shine a light on the dark and hidden reality of modern slavery and trafficking in human beings, to educate, advocate, and inspire collective action against this kind of egregious violations of human rights. So the role of ESAAMLG in combating this kind of crimes is in essence that first we assess our member jurisdictions, as I alluded to before. We monitor their progress through follow-up processes, and we also provide the necessary technical assistance and training. We also conduct typology studies. So far, we have conducted, for example, 12 typology studies, including on trafficking in human beings. I think for your attention, I just would like to bring the 2011 typology report that we did on human trafficking, which is available on the link that I indicated on the website. So based on the study, we have identified that there are still some legal and institutional gaps. The region is a source, transit, and destination for this kind of crimes. The issues in relation to internal trafficking in modern slavery should not also be ignored. The socio-economic factors, political instability, and disparities in the economy of our member jurisdiction has also been observed during the study. We have also found that there is really low level of awareness among the various stakeholders, both from private and the public sector sides. We also recognize that there were low number of detected cases by the reporting institutions, FIUs, investigators, and prosecutorial agencies. Though there might be a proper detection, we have also observed that there is no effective utilization of financial intelligence arising from this kind of emanating from the FIU in relation to these crimes. So the level of sanctions normally are not effective, dissuasive, and proportionate. There are also issues affecting overall MSCPT structure, including corruption. And finally, we have observed that our member jurisdictions are not acting proactively on international cooperation issues by prioritizing matters inconsistent with their risk and profile. So generally, I can say that there are implementation issues in relation to legal, operational, and political. And the key challenges from the private sector side include very low number of ACTRs in relation to modern slavery, THB, and associated money laundering. There is lack of proper understanding of the risks emanating from this kind of crimes. There is lack of training and awareness by the relevant competent authorities, including the regulatory and supervisory authorities. We have also observed that the outreach activities, including on the issue of guidance and feedback by the competent authorities, are really under big constraints. And sometimes there are impediments like corruption and other factors which may affect the overall AML safety system in terms of combating this kind of crimes. So in conclusion, we have observed that our AMR, mentions that there is a challenge state of the existing AML safety regimes linked to this kind of crimes. We believe that there are many things still to be done. But since the establishment of ESAAMLG in 1999, we are trying the level of our best to make sure that countries are improving their AML safety system in general by conducting assessments and providing technical assistance and training on our own or in collaboration with our partners. And we believe that a training program for the public and private sectors like this webinar will assist ESAAMLG in achieving its objective in terms of fighting modern slavery, trafficking human beings, and associated money laundering, terrorism financing offenses. So at last, please allow me to say that together, let us become the voice of the voiceless, the advocates for the oppressed, and the catalysts for a world free from modern slavery and human trafficking through the fighting of associated money laundering. Remember, history has shown the power of collective action. It is now in our hands to create a better future for the most vulnerable among us in a well-coordinated and cooperative manner, both at domestic and international levels. I submit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Muluken. So I will directly hand over to Muazu for your intervention.
Thank you very much, Simon, and I want to congratulate the program, the FAST program, as well as all colleagues that put hands together to make this a success, including, of course, our counterpart, ESAAMLG. My name is Muazu Umaro. I'm a Director of Policy and Research at GIABA. And my intervention will be quite strategic in terms of summarizing what we have seen and my experience and everything that I have seen so far dealing with this issue for over 25 years. First, let me say that it is important to recognize that there is a context, and that context is critical to understanding the problems we are facing and how to deal with them. Without understanding the context, it's going to be very, very difficult to really make headway. I do not subscribe to the fact that this is a hidden crime. I believe this is not a hidden crime. This is a very visible crime, and we see it everywhere. It's just like the trade in intellectual properties, substandard goods that we see along our roads every day. That's exactly what human trafficking is, because we see it, we touch it, we feel it. But we are not able to do something about it because the context is very difficult, and the context is important. If you look at the economic context, Sub-Saharan Africa constitutes about over 80% of Africa, 1.2 billion people. But the whole of Africa has just contributed only 3% of the global GDP, which is just around 3 trillion. And that only means that there is a lot of push factors economically that make people to migrate, whether internally or cross borders, for better opportunities to make their lives better. If you take it into context, California as a state of the United States is richer than Africa. If you take it in context, the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China is almost twice richer than Africa in terms of assets. If you also take it into context, JP Morgan is richer than Africa. I mean, if you take it into context, Apple is almost close to the richness of Africa in terms of market value of 2.64 trillion. That's what we are dealing with in terms of lack of resources. And the worst part of it is that only 5 countries constitute 50% of the GDP of Africa. That is Nigeria, South Africa, Algeria, and Morocco, along with Egypt. They constitute 50% of the GDP of Africa. That means that even the richness is not, the GDP is not equally shared, is not fairly shared across Africa. So those same countries, they also have this, a lot of discrepancy between the rich and the poor in terms of the gap is very high. And within those countries, you see a lot of migration, and you are seeing a lot of convergence of people moving towards those economic centers, whether it is Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt. You will see the urban centers being overpopulated simply because it's economic migration. So economy is very important, and we cannot underestimate it as far as the relevance of the overall issue of slavery as well as trafficking is concerned. Then, of course, we know the governance environment. We know what we are facing in Africa in terms of the rule of law, in terms of the respect for human rights and the rest of that. And of course, we know also the internal divisions in terms of religious and ethnic politics in Africa and the exclusion and alienation that takes place in the political space that further constrain the people from able to live normal lives. The social context, a lot of social pressure in terms of conflict between individuals, the security challenges, the push factors are so many. And it's important to always take those push factors into consideration when we are dealing with this. And then they are context specific. In other words, the same factors can mix up in different ways in different countries. In other words, the solution itself must be specific to context, to environment, and to situations and time. And that's where this problem is extremely difficult for us. Now we know what the pull factors are, of course. People want to migrate where they are safe. They want to migrate where they have economic opportunities. And then they see people making it when they go there, for example. Of course, not everybody makes it when he crosses to Europe, but we see people who make it. And so we are tempted to also want to do. So there are pull factors, there are push factors. And those push factors are very, very, very severe. in Africa. And there are accelerators. COVID-19 accelerated the problem. The war in Ukraine, which made things more difficult in terms of commodity costs and the rest of that. Then what we have seen as the most affected, I'm sure this is what everyone has seen around the world. It is women, it is youth, it is children. And it doesn't matter whether they are in urban areas, semi-urban or rural areas, they constitute over 50% of the problem. Why is it so? Simply because they are vulnerable. They lack economic opportunities. So it still comes back to the same thing. Lack of economic opportunities, vulnerability, power is not shared equally, and that is why they are the most affected. Children, of course, is still the issue of vulnerability, lack of care, lack of too many children around the world that people cannot take care of. It's fertility rate, it's growth rate. These things are very practical. Now, we've seen these manifestations, and we know what demonstration, whether it is forced labor, exploitation of labor for children, particularly in the rural areas, also those who are trafficked into the urban areas. We see the sexual exploitation of young women, as our guest speaker has mentioned. We see the smuggling of young women, and particularly when it comes to urban labor. Now, the intra-African migration is even far more than the international migration, and I think it's important to also give a focus to it, because often than not we undermine the challenges that we face in terms of intra-African migration, whether it is within state or between states. And I think it's important that the attention is brought beyond just the international migration, but also the international trade in human parts and the rest of that. But we also come back locally and talk with our people and understand the logic and the patterns and trends of this problem locally. This is very, very important for us. Now, the financial flows, what have we seen? In terms of financial flows, what we have seen is that definitely the traffickers are profiting from the misery of the poor and vulnerable. That's what it is. But we have seen money mules. We have seen trade-based transfers of funds. We have seen informal money transfers. And of course, this is linked to lack of financial space for them to be able to even use the formal financial services, as has been mentioned by Dr. Leona. So what I'm saying is that the issue is really intricate. It's not just one thing. You can isolate one out of the other. And that means it is context specific. And that's the challenge we have. How do we ensure that we go into a country and understand the country as is, and then design interventions and solutions that are targeted to that country? I think that's my primary concern. But we are also going to meet the challenge of the issue of cultural practices. We are going to meet the issue of lack of interest and lack of priority. And we all have to factor these risks and in terms of the solutions we provide. Now, what can we do to change things? I think we must look at the push factors. Those push factors are very important, and we must design policies and programs that will reduce those push factors, particularly in the rural areas. That is very, very important, including, of course, in the over-concentrated urban centers where you have youth sleeping on the streets and the rest of that. We need to minimize the attraction of the pull factors. How can we work with advanced countries to minimize those attractions that we see every day? Then understanding the risk. I think there is a lot of lack of understanding of the risk. Basic peculiarities of communities, of societies is very, very critical to be able to tender solutions to their peculiarities. If you come to an Islamic society, and then you begin to shout human slavery when they marry their daughters out at the age of 16. Actually, you are going to meet a deaf ears, because for them, they will feel that they are obliged to do it. So there must be a different approach to get them to understand why this is important, why your own position is important in terms of giving rights, in terms of allowing the people to mature to make the right decisions for themselves. So the approach has to change. The approach, one jacket cannot fit everyone. And I think this is where we are missing it. assuming that we can just have a common response to every problem, the same problem but different response. That is very important. So understanding the risk, the peculiarity is very important. Targeted prevention, community-led detection mechanisms. We must be able to put in communities mechanism to detect the problem so that they can report it, and probably even mechanism to deal with it at the local manner, using their own cultural practices and their acceptable ways and means. Diligent investigation. Most of the time we see people who are not really investigators who cannot stay on the investigation. After one or two things, they leave it. And I think diligent investigation is important, prosecution is important, but most importantly, effective, proportionate, and decisive sanctions. Sanction is missing, and we must bring sanction to the best. Rushing to conclude, I will say that we need to build relevant capacity across all the spectrum of stakeholders, both public and civil actors, but importantly, risk-based partnerships and cooperation, because often than not, we think all partnerships are important. They may be, but they have to be based on risks. Are we really understanding the risks when we partner with a country? That is very important. So risk-based partnerships are critical. Information sharing, investigation, and prosecution are all based on risk understanding. Asset recovery. Recovery, the asset is critical. And having the space for denying these criminals their asset is very, very important. Everything we do, you must ensure that this is entrenched, and recovering assets starts from detection. It does not start at the end. And most people forget this point, that the point you start detecting asset is when you suspect someone has committed a crime, by simply getting the person to declare his asset under oath. And then you follow it up to trace it, track it, and then ensure that you can apply to courts to forfeit it at the end and deny the person the ability to use those resources. So I come to the end, but I think a new approach is required, a risk-based understanding, situational and peculiarities must be understood, and then partnership must be based on this understanding. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Mr. Muluken and Mr. Muazu, for sharing an overview of the modern slavery situation in your regions with the member countries, to put this crime into context also, and also for being honest about the challenges, about the many challenges we are facing when it comes to the fight against modern slavery. We hope, of course, that some of these challenges are addressed with today's webinar. And also just to make or answer to one of your points, Mr. Muazu, you made about that there is not one answer to the different, or to this problem. So we have to understand the specific risks in the specific countries and find specific answers. So FAST is actually organizing roundtable events with specific countries. We are going to Nigeria, for instance, at the end of this year, where we exactly look at the specific risks together with the country and try then to tackle these specific risks with dedicated specific answers also. So just to mention that we are offering these specific country-specific roundtable events. If you're interested, just reach out to FAST and we can discuss this. So I see just one question for Mr. Muazu before we are going to take a short break. So Mr. Muazu, someone is asking if GIABA has any specific project to address the problem of modern slavery in your region.
Yeah, absolutely. We do have a number of initiatives. Actually, we just partnered with ISS. We have a program coming up at the end of this month where there will be a report that will be presented between Senegal, Sierra Leone, and a number of countries. Our own report will soon be finalized also, and then we will make it available to countries. We are also going to organize a seminar with the stakeholders in country, just the way you want to do it, to be able to, and that's why it's important to collaborate. For example, with Nigeria, we need to know what you've done so that we can just add value to what you've done instead of repeating what you've done. So I think it's an opportunity for us to partner, to particularly when you are working in our 17 member countries, to know what you are doing so that we can then add value to whatever it is you are doing. Yes, we are doing a lot on this, but as I said, it's hydra-headed, and we need to keep working at it. It's work in progress. It is never going to end soon. So I think what is important is the continuous mobilization of everyone to put hands on deck for us to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Muazu. With that, I suggest that we resume in 12 minutes. So we are in different time zones, but 40 minutes after the full hour. So in 12 minutes, I suggest that we resume with the webinar with a very interesting second half of this webinar. So see you in 12 minutes. Thank you very much. Dear participants, we start now with the second half of the webinar. We dive into different, I would say, activities and tools actually FAST came up with, but also that are out there in order to concretely tackle the issue of modern slavery. So our next speaker is Alex Mathol from Justings Advisory. She drafted an analysis of national risk assessments in the sub-Saharan region, looking at different and actually all the SARs that exist in this region, looking at the number of NRAs, national risk assessments, that analyze modern slavery actually. And I'm more than happy that she now shares her results, her study with us in the next 20 minutes. So please, Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Simon, for that introduction. And I would like to thank all the speakers for the truly insightful and thought-provoking presentations. And as I was listening to all the presenters, the thought that came to my mind is clearly we need to be able to build new avenues to win the war, as Fikile Zita mentioned. And to do that, it is important that we have a proper understanding of the context, to have a proper understanding of the nature of the threats, the vulnerabilities in each of the countries, so that, as the previous speaker said, we can respond with context-specific measures and interventions. And a national risk assessment serves as a foundational tool to be able to do that. So we embarked on an exercise in order to understand what is the status of national risk assessments within sub-Saharan Africa. The methodology that we adopted was, one, to do desktop reviews based on available information. So we did web-based searches. And the idea, well, as I said, was to understand within the 48 sub-Saharan countries, which countries have national risk assessments, in what year were these conducted, and to be able to understand whether human trafficking and modern slavery risk was properly assessed in this national risk assessment, and to also understand the nature of data and statistics that is available in order to understand the extent of prevalence based on what each of the countries would have indicated. And to also understand typologies and case studies that would have been included in the national risk assessments. But it became very clear that in our exercise that it would not just be appropriate to look at the actual national risk assessments that are published, but we also looked at other contextual data. And some of the contextual data that we looked at was the outcome of mutual evaluation reports. We also looked at annual reports that were published by some of the financial institutions, or rather financial intelligence units. We looked at data that was published by FETEV as well, and the regional bodies. We also spent a lot of time looking at what has been published by the Egmont Group around sub-Saharan Africa, reports by the United Nations, the World Bank, and the Global Slavery Index and the Trafficking in Persons report. So it was extensive data that we looked at, really to give us a view around how human trafficking and modern slavery risk is understood within sub-Saharan Africa when it comes to national risk assessments. The first, which is a very positive outcome, is that the majority of the countries within sub-Saharan Africa, which is 38 out of the 48 countries, have national risk assessments in place. And that's something that's important and that's worthwhile recognizing. But the nature of these national risk assessments varies in nature, in depth, and in periods. So there's a national risk assessment that dates back to 2013, so over 10 years, and then other national risk assessments that are in place from 2022. And the big takeaway from this part of the review that we did is that there needs to be agility in putting together national risk assessments. That human trafficking and modern slavery risk evolves in its very nature, and so do other predicate crimes, and it becomes important for countries to be able to look at the evolving context and really move to a place where national risk assessments give a better view in terms of the prevailing risk and the evolving risk over time. This is particularly important because the outcome of national risk assessments actually also has to be shared. It has to be shared with financial institutions. In many instances, it should form part of their own organizational risk assessment. So when there's a big lag certainly in terms of when national risk assessments are conducted, or even if it's thematic risk assessments, effectively it has an impact further down the value chain in terms of properly understanding the nature of the risk and how it's evolving. One of the other issues that we found is that therefore, in countries where there are long-dated national risk assessment, there are potential gaps in the nature and the type of information that currently, or the current context versus what the national risk assessment shows. The second observation from the review of the national risk assessments that we did was to look at which countries therefore mentioned human trafficking and modern slavery. The data was that 53% of that base mentioned human trafficking and modern slavery in great detail, so 53%. And then we have countries which fall within a 42% that only mentioned it at a cursory level. So somebody may ask, but what does that mean? So countries that mentioned modern slavery at a cursory level would refer to it in the form of text, that there is legislation, or there would be a table provided around predicate offenses and human trafficking and modern slavery are included in there. Or it would just be a risk that's identified without providing a lot more depth. The risk with that is that because it is provided at a cursory level without a lot more depth around understanding what are the drivers to the risk, the ability of the countries to respond may be impeded. Of the countries that mentioned human trafficking in greater detail, what was positive, and these are best practices, was that the countries went beyond making assertions about modern slavery and human trafficking being a risk, but they gave context around the nature and the extent of the risk. They gave context about the profile of the perpetrators. They gave context about what are the contributing factors that make victims vulnerable. And they gave statistics. And this is the place where we hope, with the outcome of this review, that more and more countries move to a place where national risk assessments provide a lot more details so that that context can be better understood and a risk-based approach can be adopted, which is informed by the context. In trying to understand why some of the countries only made reference to it at a cursory level, we realized that there are a number of contributing factors. Some countries, struggle with resources, struggle with capabilities, and capacity, and so there hasn't been the resources and the ability and the depth to be able to do a lot more work. So those are some of the contributing factors. But one of the things that also emerged was that even though some countries made a cursory reference to human trafficking, when one looks at the Global Slavery Index, and when you look at the Trafficking in Persons report, you see that there's a higher prevalence rate for modern slavery and human trafficking. Malaika made a very interesting statistic, and she said Africa has a 64% vulnerability score. And so when you therefore look at what these global surveys are saying, and you look at a high vulnerability score, it just points also to the fact that as countries do national risk assessments, it's also important to be able to look at other secondary data sources, where a country may not necessarily have enough statistics. So when a country does not have enough quantitative data in order to understand the risk, it's also important to look at other qualitative factors or other secondary sources, other expert insights, in order to inform the view around what potentially is the modern slavery risk profile of the country. So again, overall, what we saw was that determining the scale, therefore, appears to be a challenge for several jurisdictions. And another observation that came out from the national risk assessments is that in the countries where there is an awareness around the scale of this crime, understanding the related money laundering risks was limited. So the connection between modern slavery and money laundering risk was not strong, and therefore, the understanding of the flow of funds related to modern slavery was very limited, and there's an opportunity for us to be able to do better. The third part that we looked at was understanding which of the countries, or how many countries, actually went to conduct a proper assessment and evaluation of the risk. First was that the risk was identified in the majority of the countries, but when it came to assessing the risk in terms of understanding the nature of the threat, understanding the nature of the vulnerability, understanding the potential consequence or impact, we found that only 16 countries out of the 38 that had risk assessment, only 16 of those countries had actually assessed and evaluated the nature of the risk. Again, possible contributory factors was that some countries are not aware of the extent of the problem. And we talked about earlier that, there's a lack of capacity and resources to respond appropriately. And what we also found was that in other countries, other crimes like corruption and drug trafficking appeared to be receiving more priority. And again, informed by the fact that law enforcement responds on what they perceive to be priority. And here it again emphasizes the point that was made by Leona, that there's an underreporting of modern slavery, and it is under-identified. So national risk assessments, I think, serve a strategic role in really helping us to address the issue around under-identification, because it requires deeper application of mind. When we looked at statistics across the 48 countries, we realized that most countries did not provide comprehensive statistics. Of the full base, only 16 countries reported the number of investigations, prosecutions, convictions, and values involved, and obviously confiscation. Actually, we found that only one country of the full base, for instance, reported on confiscations. Convictions, even a lower number. But when one looks at the absolute number of cases that were investigated, absolute number of prosecutions, it is still relatively low, considering what is the estimated number of people that are trafficked out of the continent, when one looks at the numbers around illicit flows coming from the continent. So this is a big area where there's an opportunity to be able to improve in terms of what is in national risk assessment. We found obviously significant disparities in the data that was reported. So it was very difficult for us to be able to do a comparative analysis across countries. But again, an opportunity here to do better. So the best practices that came out with flagging is the importance to be able to give detail on context and factors contributing to modern slavery. So risk profiling becomes very important. And in the risk profiling, factors that are important to be able to capture going forward around, and this is not just in the National Risk Assessment. I also think that these factors are relevant for institutions when they do their institutional risk assessments. To be able to look at geographic location, whether a country is a transit point for regional or international trade, whether maritime or land trade. We found in the assessments that the porosity of borders is a contributing factor when it comes to vulnerability, and dislocation of people and displacement of people, where we end up having illegal immigration and where we have refugee communities where people are literally having to run for their lives. These create points of vulnerability. It also becomes important in national risk assessments to look at the context of neighboring countries, areas of political volatility and the security situation. One of the questions related to terror financing, there was evidence in some countries where there were wars that had the characteristic of terror-related activities that modern slavery actually features as an activity that takes place within that context. So it becomes important for each country to understand whether by virtue of vulnerability, whether a country is a source country, a transit country, or a destination country. The other piece, it's important for going forward to be able to look at the population profile and demographics of each country. The point around economic conditions and the nature of economic activity cannot be underestimated. It needs to feature much strongly in national risk assessments when one looks at modern slavery and human trafficking. Where a country has high risk economic sectors, those must be considered. Where there's a cash-based economy, and which is a significant part of what happens within sub-Saharan Africa. Trends in illicit financial flows, poverty, and the levels of financial inclusion or financial exclusion contribute to the vulnerability of people for human trafficking and modern slavery. And the issue around prevalence of other predicate offenses that are correlated to human trafficking and modern slavery needs a closer look at. For instance, corruption, we talked about terrorist activity, money laundering, and drug trafficking. We found in the review that these are actually at times interconnected when it comes to complex syndicates. Modern slavery has a commercial motive, and often it is linked to corruption, is often linked to money laundering, and we see this connection with drug trafficking. And we talked about the profile of perpetrators and victims. And it's important as part of the risk assessment to be able to look at the effectiveness of enforcement mechanism, the issue around sanctions and the like. So in closing, what we can improve upon in the region is to be able to drive better risk assessments and risk rating to inform appropriate response strategy and allocation of resources, so that we can adopt that risk-based approach. National risk assessment that has a risk assessment and evaluation in it is able to inform prioritization and how resources are deployed. And the second takeaway, what we can improve upon is embedding more systemic and structured data collection, particularly when it comes to statistical data around number of cases reported, number of cases investigated, cases before court, number of suspects, estimated financial value, convictions, and ultimately, amounts seized, which are frozen and confiscated. All of those must be backed by trend analysis so that year on year, there can be an indication around whether the situation is getting better or whether it's not improving as expected. And then it informs the appropriate measures to respond to the trend that we're seeing. And again, we talked about just developing a better understanding of the correlation between modern slavery, corruption, and money laundering. Ultimately, the idea is to be able to disrupt the money flow. And that comes back to building evidence around financial flows. Suspicious transaction reporting is very important to be able to build that evidence. Currently, there's been very limited that has been certainly captured in the analysis that we've done. So the presentation that will be done by Frank, I think it's important to be able to help us improve in terms of reporting of suspicious transaction and suspicious activity. And ultimately, understanding that link between financial inclusion or exclusion and modern slavery vulnerability becomes part of a bigger strategy to responding to this, pandemic. Really, it's becoming a pandemic as one looks at it. And the final comment that I wanted to make is around better coordination amongst responsible agencies. What we found in the review that we did is that in different countries, you have different agencies that are responsible. You may have the Department of Justice, you have the Financial Intelligence Unit, you have law enforcement, and in a number of instances, there was at times disjointed approaches. So there is an opportunity for better collaboration and better coordination. And to make sure that data that's reported internationally is also factored into the responses locally, where there's a difference of opinion clearly that the country has considered the impact. So that's really the summary of the report that we did. The detailed report is available on the FAST website, which really summarizes the findings across all the African countries that we reviewed. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you so much, Alex, for providing a summary of this highly interesting and also important report you drafted. Actually, we will share this report after the webinar with all the participants, and I highly recommend to read through the report because it provides a great overview and a great insights and also best practices and what can be done actually to include modern slavery in national risk assessments. So actually the next intervention is from myself exactly on this topic. So I will just share my screen, and if just someone can quickly confirm that you see my screen and the presentation.
We do.
Perfect. So actually this intervention directly refers, of course, to Alex's presentation that we just saw and heard on national risk assessment. So Alex did a specific study on sub-Saharan Africa. And what we did within FAST is actually a guideline that you will see later on how to include modern slavery in national risk assessments. And also the first question is, why is it actually important to include modern slavery in NRAs? So when I speak about NRAs, I speak of national risk assessment. So my short presentation is really on the why and on the how. So what we did within FAST is not looking at a specific region, but actually looking at all the regions in the world, analyzing 27 NRAs in 2021. And the question was, is modern slavery addressed in these NRAs? And when we look then at the numbers, we could see that 30%, so around 1/3 of the analyzed NRAs address modern slavery comprehensively, which means that modern slavery is treated, for instance, in a specific chapter. So this means that actually when we look at the global picture compared to sub-Saharan Africa, we see that in sub-Saharan Africa, actually more NRAs include modern slavery, which is a very positive result. Because looking at the global figures, we see that still 70% of the NRAs do not address modern slavery comprehensively. And even in those NRAs where modern slavery is addressed comprehensively, the numbers regarding modern slavery are just very low. So looking at the numbers of suspicious transactions reports, the number of investigations, convictions. Even those countries that included modern slavery, these numbers were very low. So when we look at the worldwide estimates of modern slavery, so the 150 billion US dollars of annual profit estimated, and this is a conservative estimate, looking at the 50 million people estimated to live in these conditions as of today, and then looking at the specific numbers we see, the numbers of STRs, the numbers of convictions and investigations, we see that there is an obvious gap between these estimates and the numbers. And so why are NRAs so important in this whole picture? It is because NRAs serve as the basis for a country's priorities in the AML-CFT field. So if modern slavery, and that's the whole narrative, is a priority in the national risk assessment, actually, then it is a priority to fight money laundering and terrorism financing, and it becomes then also for the private sector, of course, who conducts its own risk assessment. Financial institutions conduct their own risk assessments. It becomes also a priority for them. And this is in order to break this vicious circle. So what is the vicious circle of modern slavery? This means that we see very low number of STRs being sent from financial institutions to the FIUs. And this means then that in NRAs, as we just saw, modern slavery does not play, often not play a priority, or is often not a priority, which means again that there are not many typologies being shared with the different public authorities, but also with the financial institutions. There are not many indicators shared, which means again then that there are not many STRs from these financial institutions to the FIU. So NRAs really can break this vicious circle by including modern slavery objectively in national risk assessment. And the question now is how? How can this be done? How can modern slavery be addressed comprehensively in national risk assessment? Well, FAST has recently published a guideline that we drafted together with the three, I would say, largest NRA methodology providers: World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and Council of Europe. And we will, of course, share this report, this guideline with you after this webinar. And there are two goals in this guideline: to raise awareness on what I just did, say why it is so important to include modern slavery in NRAs, and then concretely provide examples, guidance on how this can be done. And we focus there on the threats and the vulnerabilities. So the first stage of a risk assessment, the identification stage. Why do we focus on the identification stage? It is because if a predicate offense like modern slavery is not identified as a priority in the identification stage, it is not very probable that then later on during the risk assessment process it will be included. And this is why we focus on the threats of modern slavery and the vulnerabilities of modern slavery, and how these threats and vulnerabilities can be identified and assessed. So how to better identify modern slavery threats? Again, we will share the guidance with you where you can read the details. We came up with, I would say, very precise, condensed three ideas. So first of all, consult publicly available information sources. There are actually many information sources out there that exactly help countries during the risk assessment to get a more objective picture of the modern slavery threat. For instance, Global Slavery Index, the global estimates of modern slavery. We heard from ESAAMLG that they came up with a typologies report, right? So also the FSRBs are publishing relevant information. Then include stakeholders beyond the traditional AML-CFT players in the risk assessment process. So include NGOs and non-governmental organizations, especially include survivors we heard a perfect example from Malaika today and her NGO, a survivor-led NGO. So include these stakeholders that might not be traditional in the AML CFT world. Most countries do have a national anti-trafficking coordinator. Bring this coordinator to the table during the threats assessment. And also gather information from similar jurisdictions if you might not have the information that you need. So similar jurisdictions are those that have comparable economic, social, geographic, or other contextual conditions. Look how they have done it, what they have come up with to get ideas for your own risk assessment. And then we look at the vulnerabilities. So what are potential modern slavery vulnerabilities, and that should be identified and assessed? Well, first of all, and we heard this already also, of course, from Alex in her presentation just before, focus on timely and effective information sharing, coordination, and cooperation processes on a national, but also international level. So an ineffective, not timely information sharing on this national and international level actually constitutes a vulnerability, because especially modern slavery does not stop at borders. So it's so important that there is an international, of course, component, and also that national stakeholders do not work in silos, but collaborate, cooperate with each other. We heard from Leona and also from Malaika today, financial inclusion. So financial exclusion, of course, constitutes a vulnerability to modern slavery. And we've seen good examples in national risk assessments in sub-Saharan Africa that actually address financial inclusion, exclusion. So this is really something countries should focus on during their risk assessment. And then the last point, focus on training of governmental institutions, but also reporting entities, so that they know, reporting entities, how they can report these suspicious activities to the public authorities, and also governmental institutions, that they know what their role is, what role they play in the fight against modern slavery. So with that, I hope that we have provided a good overview about the situation in sub-Saharan Africa, but then also more concretely on why it is important to include modern slavery in risk assessments and how this can be done. So I just look at the question. I don't see any specific question on NRAs, which is why I would remind you that please ask the questions that you might have in the Q&A box that you have at the bottom of your screen. And with that, I would like to hand over to my colleague, Frank, who will make a double presentation, actually. So the first part is on how to better detect suspicions of modern slavery. When looking at the chat, I think that's something that all the participants have been waiting for. When we look at the number of the low number of STRs, I think this is a crucial presentation. And then directly after this part, Frank will also talk about the importance of public-private partnerships. So Frank, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Simon. And indeed, I was very pleased to see that many participants already asked for ways how the financial industry can detect human trafficking, because this shows that you understand as a public side what crucial role they play. To be very direct in this regards, you depend totally from the private sector when it comes to identifying human trafficking through the financial sector, because if they are not able to find the transactions, they will not report it to you, and if they not report it to you, you will never know. Therefore, I would like to give you already the first information in this regards, and this is that the role that banks can play is not only about transaction monitoring, like you will hear in many places. It's really covering all aspects of their compliance framework. So they can integrate anti-modern slavery measures in those 4 broad areas of a compliance framework, which are governance, risk analysis and policies, training and awareness, cooperation, inclusion and social responsibility, and then of course customer due diligence and transaction monitoring. We'll focus on the latter one later, but just already mentioned to you that those 4 areas are covered in a self-assessment tool that FAST created. The self-assessment tool is for free, and it can be used by financial institutions to assess the quality of their compliance framework when it comes to anti-modern slavery. And in the end, what it does is to generate a tailor-made report for that specific financial institution. The financial institution will be provided with an overall score from an anti-modern slavery perspective, but then also it will go into more detail into the 4 areas I mentioned. And what is certainly the most important aspect, it will provide very specific and hands-on recommendations on how they can become better in fighting human trafficking. So please encourage your financial institutions to take that self-assessment. As I said, it's anonymous, it's for free. I think it's worth it. But for those of you who don't like self-assessments, I would just go into the 4 different areas and give you, I would say, like my favorite recommendations, because they are in a way very easy to implement, and at the same time they have a major outcome when it comes to fighting human trafficking. And in the field of governance, risk analysis, and policies, this is to include the topic of modern slavery in the financial institutions risk analysis. So like what Alex and Simon explained on the NRA level, on the country level, every financial institution has to perform a financial institution-specific risk analysis. And this one is the basis of every compliance measure in the AFC field that a bank takes. What's the best way to motivate banks to do that? Well, actually, it is to include it in your national risk assessment, because what banks do is when they draft the financial institution's risk-specific analysis, they look always into the national risk analysis and try to cover all the topics mentioned there. The other aspect is that you should encourage financial institutions to have procedures in place on how to address human trafficking or modern slavery related cases. This includes a question on if they should report it always as a suspicious activity report. I would certainly recommend that, but also maybe in parallel, they should also reach out to the police. The other question is, what do you do as a bank if someone opens an account and it's quite obvious that we are facing a situation of human trafficking? What do you as country want? Do you want the bank to refuse the opening of the account? Or would you suggest that they should open it in order to enable them to create financial intelligence and proof of a broader human trafficking apparatus behind it? But banks need guidance relating to this, so please reach out to them and be very specific what you expect them to do. On the training and awareness field, there's a very easy way to raise awareness on human trafficking, and this is by banks including the topic into the already existing money laundering and terrorist financing trainings for staff. So every bank in the world does that on a periodic way. So why not including the aspect of modern slavery as predicate offense for a use case in such a course? Very easy forward-going way to highlight the topic. Obviously, it's even better if financial institutions provide specific courses on modern slavery, in the best case by including survivors of the crime as presenters of that topic, or at least involve their views. You have heard Malaika Ringo from Footprint for Freedom. I think she's an excellent example of the high quality when it comes to presentations by survivors of modern slavery. FAST counts with a broad network of survivors, and we will be happy to put you in touch when you're interested and if you want to promote this approach within your financial industry. Then in the field of cooperation, inclusion, and social responsibility, that's engagement in public-private partnerships in fighting human trafficking. I will say something on that later on. And then the importance that you should avoid that banks de-risk entire populations because they fear that they can't manage the risk. Leona mentioned this already very thoroughly. Just to make it again clear. The risking is when a bank decides to not have any business with someone from a certain country or industry, but this is not what the FATF expects you to do. So banks have to manage risk, not to avoid risk. Otherwise, this leads to the financial exclusion of populations. They will have to find alternative ways, dubious ways to perform their businesses, and this leading even to the risk of them being trafficked and to the risk of the entire crime being more prevalent. We already heard that also from Malaika. Now into deep dive, the first step is customer due diligence. What we propose here as FAST is to use a concept we call the modern slavery high-risk client. As you know, financial institutions have this high-risk client from an anti-money laundering perspective, usually based on the country of the client and the industry the client is a part of, and the combination of both aspects and the relative risk rankings make that there's an overall risk for the client. And if it's a high-risk client, enhanced due diligence measures are applied, transaction monitoring is more specific, and so on. And this you can perfectly do as a bank, also from the perspective from modern slavery, because also here we have industries that are more prevalent when it comes to modern slavery. I think the pictures speak for themselves. And as well, you have countries with a higher risk to being related to human trafficking. So if you have both combination elements, at least, then the bank should apply the same enhanced due diligence measures and transaction monitoring measures as they do for money laundering high-risk clients. You might ask what those high-risk countries are. This is different to money laundering. So in money laundering, you have a global ranking system, basically, depending on the legal framework and what the country does. In modern slavery, it depends on where you are, what your high-risk countries are. So if for banks in sub-Saharan Africa, the countries that are for high risk you see here, and please don't get me wrong, it's not high-risk countries in sub-Saharan Africa, it's high-risk countries for sub-Saharan Africa, because that's where most victims and perpetrators come from in the relevant countries' statistics. In the case of sub-Saharan Africa, this happens to be mostly countries within the region, but there's an exception, Lebanon, because we have a high prevalence of organized crime from this country linked to modern slavery activities in sub-Saharan Africa. Just to make one point clear, if your country is one of those marked in red, so a high-risk country for the region, it makes obviously no sense to tell your financial industry that they should treat your own country as a high-risk country, because then you don't have simply this risk-based approach being effective. So in this case, please only pass the other countries on to your financial industry. Then we come to transaction monitoring. And in this one, I think it's very important. The most cases for money laundering and terror financing investigations come from the automated monitoring system banks have. Through banks, you will see a number of transactions flowing, either because someone makes a transaction to a bank's client, because a bank's client makes a transference to someone else, or because banks move money through other banks within correspondent banking. And some banks perform millions of transactions per day in this way. And it's obvious that humans can't look at them all. And therefore, monitoring systems come into play. And based on algorithms and patterns, they filter out those transactions that could be relevant. A human being, a compliance officer, looks at them. And if they find the case relevant, a suspicious activity report is filed, the FIU is going to check and enrich it. It goes to law enforcement, and in the best case, it leads to the conviction of the criminal and the seizure of the profits. Now, in human trafficking, as Simon mentioned, we have very low numbers of SARS, although we have this high volume of money being moved related to human trafficking. And this is for two reasons. The first reason is that indicators that you will find in reports out there, and there are many, simply do not fit to the reality of automated transaction monitoring. So banks are not able to implement that. And as they are not able to implement it, it never goes through this bottleneck of transaction monitoring filter. So it never goes to a compliance officer who could actually use those indicators, which are more investigation related. The other aspect is that some indicators that in principle could be used by a transaction monitoring system are exactly the same as money laundering indicators, so the same pattern. And obviously then the person having to treat the situation maybe treats it only as a money laundering case, and it's never reported as modern slavery case as well. Now, why is that this pattern thing between money laundering on the one side and modern slavery? I just want to show you an example to make it more clear. There are many others different, but this one is pretty clear. And what you see here is a typical pattern of a so-called channeling. So different actors split money, and then it's going to be bundled with a bank's client. And the sum of those transactions that are all the same are then forwarded to a party behind. Now, this typical money laundering pattern, for which banks usually have already an indicator in place, you will also find in modern slavery case. So take, for instance, a situation of debt bondage through the payment of rent. So you have an exploitative company and the employees are renting the stay from the company, and the entire sum of their income is equal to the rent. So you will have all those employees paying exactly the same rent to the exploitative company, which then forwards the earnings to the parties behind the ultimate beneficial owner, for instance. There's another modern slavery activity that has exactly the same pattern, and that's the online child sexual exploitation. So cases where children are abused in a live webcam situation. And there, the ones on the left are not the victims. In this case, they are the perpetrators watching those videos, transferring the fee to a broadcast platform that will be the client, and the broadcast platform forwards the sum of this income to the perpetrators filming the crime. Now, is this a problem that we have the same pattern for money laundering as well? I think it's a chance. FAST thinks it's a chance, and therefore what we do is to promote a way forward where you just have as bank to modify slightly the indicators you already have, copy them, and use them as modern slavery indicators as well. So in the case of the debt bondage situation, you already become a very specific modern slavery related indicator when you ask for the client receiving the same money to be a modern slavery high-risk client. So as I mentioned, a company from a high-risk industry and a high-risk country receiving such same amounts and then forwarding it, it's the probability that it is modern slavery, not a money laundering scheme, is quite high. The same is true for the online child sexual exploitation scheme. In this case, what makes sense is to require by the indicator that the recipient in the end has an address or a BIC, if it's a bank, from the Philippines. And this is the case because the Philippines are, for example, the country where most cases of live streaming of child abuse happen. So again, if you have that pattern and the money in the end flows to the Philippines, you have a high probability of it being modern slavery and not money laundering. You will find those indicators and others in those two reports you see here. We will share with you afterwards. I just picked those two because it's quite a new report, but we already know that banks around the world used those indicators to identify relevant cases of forced labor and online child sexual exploitation. They reported on that basis. It's probably the first time that modern slavery is detected through automated transaction monitoring. So this works. It's not difficult. It's effective. So if you have to pick two, please promote those two. And with that, I go to public-private partnership section of my presentation. Simon, could you just indicate the time to me? Because I think we were a little over time.
Frank, take your time, and it's important to talk slowly so that the translators can catch up, actually. So take your time.
Okay, fair point, and apologies to the translators if I have been too fast, but it's already in the name. So public-private partnerships are collaborations between the public side, so you, and your private sectors. And what is important here is to really highlight the aspect of partnership. So you meet here as equals. That's sometimes a little difficult for the public side to accept that situation, that you can't simply order things. But it has proven to be very efficient, and it is a global trend. And this includes also modern slavery. I was happy to hear Fikile and Mwazu saying two things. One, collaboration is important, and the other thing, it has to be risk-based. We have both when it comes to PPPs regarding modern slavery. So far, the topic of modern slavery is the third most prevalent within PPPs in the world. Right after money laundering and terrorist financing, which are core topics, as you know. So I think this already shows how the risk perception globally is, and how important modern slavery is ranked. You see here different examples of PPPs I brought you. I just will start with the one on the right, Gimlet. This is a British one, probably the first one who covered modern slavery. And this one is interesting because the British legislation allows for the sharing of operational data. So here really the police can share data on suspects, and banks search for those suspects. Has been proven to be very efficient. On the bottom, you will find AFCA, the German Anti-Financial Crime Alliance, the German PPP. Here you have exactly the opposite. In Germany, it's nearly impossible to share any operational data and names, even of convicted persons. So they focused on strategic exchange and the design of papers and best practices. Also very, very efficient with great results. Then you have EFIP, the Europol Financial Intelligence Public-Private Partnership. They are currently working on human trafficking. And I mentioned this one because the first one of an international nature is cross-border, including like 15 of the most important banks in the world, police forces, FIUs from different countries. So the topic is also becoming international. Maybe something you could also consider to have a regional PPP in place. And then, last but not least, on the contrary, excellent example of a PPP is ESAAMLG, the South African Anti-Money Laundering Integrated Task Force. So PPP from the region, very well respected, produced great results. So an example for you to follow, for sure. Also happy to provide the contacts to ESAAMLG, to the colleagues from ESAAMLG, if you're interested to learn more from them. However, you don't only have to learn from them. We are here to help you as well. This is our job. We are doing that already with several countries that, based on our help, establish public-private partnerships with great results. So please reach out to us. We will be happy to help. And the first paper to read in this regards is from the colleagues from UNODC, a compendium of promising practices, so that you already get a first impression of what can be done. And with that, thank you all for your interest, for your time, and please be aware that you're in a special situation as financial sector, public and private side, to make a change for people, for victims of the crime. So please use the power to change the reality. And back to you, Simon.
Thanks so much, Frank, for these two super important topics. So the detection of suspicious activity and public-private partnership. And by looking at to the chat, to the Q&A function, I think there's a very relevant question in there that goes to the high-risk modern slavery client. So that question is, Frank, what will constitute an indicator for individual or entities to be identified as high risk for modern slavery? If you could give maybe or emphasize once again how this can be done.
So on the one side, as I mentioned, the country, usually based on data regarding where most victims and perpetrators come from. The other aspect is the industry, and you will find a list of such industries, which are basically the same in most countries. in the report I mentioned, the indicators report from FAST, we will share with you, and then you can check yourself.
Thank you very much, Frank. And actually, I'm happy to see that there are no more open questions in the Q&A function. And also, we were able to catch up time quite well, which brings us to the end of this webinar. So when we look at the objectives I mentioned at the very beginning of this webinar, especially that we would like to improve quantity and quality of modern slavery related STRs from the financial institutions to financial intelligence units, which means then that hopefully there are more disseminations to law enforcement, more investigations, more convictions. And then, and I think that's highly important to always keep this in mind, the ultimate goal is more remedy, compensation to victims. So having this goal in mind, I hope that you have gained some more insights, that you have some more tools in your toolbox on how this goal can be achieved through the detection of suspicious activities. What Frank now just has explained. Again, we will share the relevant reports by setting up a public-private partnership, having a component, a modern slavery component within this public-private partnership. We see this works. This has worked for those PPPs that have been established. National risk assessments, right? That determine a priority, a country's priority in the fight against money laundering and terrorism financing. And then, of course, also we saw financial inclusion. We heard about financial inclusion and how this is related to anti-money laundering. And I think that's also something when we talk about modern slavery in the financial sector, we always have to think about. And I think the last person I would like to mention is Malaika Oringo, because that's what we try. We always try to bring in survivors to give this crime a face, to make this crime tangible, because this is a reality. And so I'm especially grateful that Malaika was with us today, shared her insights with us. And yeah, I really hope that now you know more, you have more tools to really fight this crime. Reach out to us also to FAST for a roundtable event, for instance, in a specific country, or in case you have any further questions, we are happy to help. And with that, I would like to thank the speakers, of course, all the speakers for your insights. I think it was very interesting, very insightful, different perspectives. To the participants that you stayed with us, I think the numbers were very stable throughout the whole webinar, so very positive. Thanks for listening to us. And then also the interpreters, of course, who made it possible for us, so that we did not need to learn Portuguese and French over the night, but so that we could really reach the whole region, Portuguese and French. So thank you for you. Thank you to you as well. And with that, I wish you a pleasant afternoon and evening, and goodbye. Thank you.